it's starting to warm up now earlier, and we have bud break throughout the valley. But I want to know, what does that signify, and how do the different varietals open and have bud break at different times?
So certain varietals are considered later ripening or earlier ripening varietals, and that directly correlates to when they have bud break in most cases. So right now in the Napa Valley, the vines that have bud break are the Chardonnay vines. There may be a few other varietals where there's a few vines that have bud break, but everyone that I've spoken to, everything that I've seen so far, it's just Chardonnay in Napa at least. And that tends to be earlier ripening and earlier harvest. People are often going to be harvesting their Chardonnays in September, where something like the Cabernet Sauvignons, Merlots, those are going to be in October usually here. So our Pinot Noir is close to bud break. We have bud swelling happening in the vineyard where this Pinot Noir is from. So we are really a matter of maybe 5 days away from bud break, 6 days away, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, so hopefully once we have bud break, we don't have any hard freezes. That's always a concern, you know, because we don't want any damage when the vines are at their most vulnerable. So as soon as the buds shoot, there are these fresh little green the leaves that are they're babies, really. They're juveniles, and they can't withstand the really cold temperatures. So if we get bud break too early, there's a risk. Bud break late, then the risk is just, you know, it's going to take a long time to ripen, and then we bump up into fire season or rainy season.
It's interesting. Let me just back up for a second, because you have Chardonnay that is already going through bud break, and Pinot's close behind, and Chardonnay and Pinot are both cool weather grapes. So they should, you would think, kind of have bud break in close proximity to each other. And then that's when it sounds like the danger and susceptibility can happen, because now the bud is exposed, and like you said, you could have a hard frost. That's not good. Then you have, what's the next demarcation or life cycle after bud break? Is it flowering or?
Yeah, so after bud break, you know, shoots start to grow, and then you have flowering in the spring, and flowering is what determines the fruit set for the cluster. So all the little tiny individual white flowers that you see are actually the berry, where the berries are going to be. So if you get a hail event or something that shatters the flowers, your clusters are actually going to be looser, and there's not going to be as many berries. And that did happen to us in one of our vineyards in 2021. And if you have like nice, calm, perfect weather, then you tend to get more berries, because all of the flowers make it and are pollinated and create all the little berries on the cluster.
And it's interesting because Shayna told us that you can actually slice open the buds and take a microscope and see the clusters forming before they're even formed. And so here we have a little bit of a life cycle of a bud with its microscopic image underneath. And as you move through the evolution and stages of growth, you can just see how much more developed the cluster becomes, and then the little teeny grapes that are going to be down here at the end. I mean, it's fantastic from that standpoint.
This is a really good picture of a cross section of the bud. So you can so right now our Pinot Noir vineyard is somewhere between C and D.
Oh, wow.
Okay. It's swelling. Yeah. So some of the vines are closer to C, other ones are like D. They're almost ready to push, and E is basically bud break, right? And if you cut the buds in half, you can see the primary bud where the apical meristem is. So kind of like right in the middle, the part that the shoot is going to grow the fastest. And then there's a secondary bud that's below it. And then another secondary bud or tertiary bud that's just above it. So if the first bud gets damaged, sometimes you can still get fruit, because you'll have a secondary bud that will then create a shoot. And if it's fruitful, if there's little teeny microscopic clusters that are already there, then those will form, and you'll still get grapes on the vine.
And Natalie, how much of this did you know before you came on board?
So when I decided to partner with Shayna, I did start taking some classes at UC Davis online, which, it doesn't matter where you guys are located. You guys could all take those classes as well. And I learned a lot. And it was just so mind blowing how the harvest, like the potential of the harvest is already predetermined from the previous year. Like it's like stored inside the vine. Like that is so cool. And touching on one of the things that Shayna said just a couple minutes ago, when the flowering happens, and if there aren't any big weather events that you get that damages those flowers, you get so much fruit. And you guys are tasting our 2018 Pinot Noir, and that was a really heavy year in Napa Valley. It was a super long harvest, right, Shayna? Am I mixing up my vintages right now?
19 was longer, but 18 was more fruitful. 18 had a heavier set. So
heavier set. That was it. Yeah. Much heavier set. Like everything picked really heavy. So everything was very well protected early season. So it was pretty cool to see year to year, the differences.
And here's actually what you were talking about, Shayna, with regards to the primary bud that comes out and then the two secondary buds. And these will throw fruit.
So they can, yeah. It depends upon how healthy the vine is and how fruitful it is based on previous year's conditions. But yeah, so if the primary bud suffers damage and the larger secondary bud is not damaged because it's still basically dormant, it can then grow a shoot and tendrils and have clusters. So however many little clusters that are predetermined inside the bud are there can then become fruit. So most buds are going to have between 1 and 3 clusters, depending upon the fruitfulness.
And how do you determine if it can throw fruit? Each cluster is going to be different from a quality standpoint. How do you make the determination or talk to the growers and say, all right, I need to drop some fruit because these clusters are not as well formed as the primary cluster? How do you make that decision, knowing that it's going to obviously impact yield?
Yeah, so as far as this vineyard is concerned, it's a relatively small block. So I can actually go to the block and I can walk every single row and can even help out with dropping. So like I'll bring my secateurs and I'll just clip off ones that I don't like. And then I can also have Garvey Vineyard Management go through and do their traditional crop dropping where they might say, okay, if there's more than 2 clusters per shoot, the higher cluster will drop, just sort of rule of thumb. But it's a relatively small block. So we can kind of go through and vine by vine, check it out and see which clusters look the best, taste the best, and then get rid of anything that we think is just actually sapping nutrients and isn't necessarily going to make it into the final picking bin.
And out of curiosity, because I would have thought the opposite is true, why does the high cluster get dropped?
So the high cluster doesn't always get dropped, but the high cluster would be the 3rd cluster to form, right? Well, it's the first to shoot, it's the 3rd cluster to form. So it's usually the smaller one. And oftentimes you see like second crop, which is like way up high. Those like green ones, those will get dropped as well. So it's just sort of rule of thumb, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes that might be the cluster,
Interesting. And Natalie, as a vineyard, do you see the economics of dropping fruit and feel pain, or?
No, because I know, I mean, to be frank, we pay by the ton. So we want to get the best fruit possible and work with our growers to, bring the potential of those wines to fruition. So we want it to be the best possible product.
Well, and I think that's one of a dozen or more distinctions between limited production and smaller wineries than mass production wines. There's no one going through rows for XYZ $2 chuck and dropping fruit. They're actually picking fruit off the ground that may have fallen inadvertently and throwing that into the bin. So it's quite a big difference.